This lecture is on a very troubling thesis of Nietzsche's, the eternal recurrence. Before I discuss Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence, I want to do a little bit of what I promised that I would do last time when I recounted the parable of the death of God, and that's to interpret it a little bit more. One of the nice things about parables, and I'm going to compare that parable to some other parables, one of the nice things about parables is that, in a certain sense, if one is to read them at all, engage in reading them at all, parables require interpretation. They quite literally can't mean what they say quite literally. And if you notice in many traditions, the attempt to communicate through a parable is the attempt to communicate a truth that, as it were, could not possibly be communicated in another sort of more linear form without, as it were, the aid of a story. You may, for example, notice that Christ in the New Testament uses parables far more often than he uses demonstrative arguments, far more often than he presents position papers, far more often than he testifies before Congress, far more often than he gives news conferences. And perhaps it's because that the tradition of the parable is one in which the listener is forced to tap into their own autonomy and their own self-creation in order to engage the parable at all. So something similar is true, and I think of the parables and parable, as you recall, I've droned on and on about Nietzsche's many styles, but the parable is again a style that Nietzsche uses to convey a kind of truth, a kind of new way of looking at things without, as it were, the direct communication which I think that he rightly believes views like his cannot receive. And it's not as though, and this is why I've been so reluctant throughout to present Nietzsche as a philosopher. I've been equally reluctant, I hope you've noticed, to present him as a literary figure, which seems to me, if I said being presented as a mere philosopher was degrading, to be presented as a mere literary figure, especially in a culture like ours today, considering the people that go on book tours, it would be even more degrading. So I don't want to view Nietzsche's text as merely philosophical or merely literary, but to try to view Nietzsche's text as in some way exemplary and as in special. And the way that I indicated that early on, and I'll mention it again now, is I said in a certain way, and I did use this example from philosophy, Nietzsche wanted to impossibly play Plato to his own Socrates, to invent himself as such a character that would stand out above the other texts within which his were produced. And this act of self-creation it also occurs in literary figures, or the attempt is made, and I can think of two examples, Proust and James Joyce, where the attempt is made certainly to take the stuff of one's own life and to recreate it in a mythical space that is much larger, as it were, than what someone might call the pathetic, embodied ruins of any singular life. Because at one level, all our lives end in a dirty little tragedy in some corner anyway, in some sense. So this attempt is, in a way, is an attempt to write in such a way as to live beyond oneself in an act of self-creation. And I think Joyce and Proust are fair comparisons in some regards to Nietzsche in this way. Okay, I ended, as I said, I was going to say a little more about the death of God parable. So let me say something first, very flat-footed and ordinary about it. There is a sociological dimension to the death of God parable. And by that I mean that the death of God for Nietzsche is a trope or a metaphor that signals some, perhaps still on its way. You notice, if you listen to the parable carefully, perhaps still on its way event. One that it's already happened, but it's still on its way in the sense that it is yet to become understood in all its dimensions, in its fullness. In the same way one might say that a very bright child is a project on the way to something, but it's still not fully developed in all the ramifications of what that child will eventually be have not become apparent. So in something like that way, you could begin with the sociological observation that something profound has shifted somewhere in the 18th, in the transformations from, say, the 14th through the 18th and 19th centuries, and Nietzsche being, as I say, paradigmatically the philosopher of the 20th century, even though he died in 1900. So this event will be, the sociological remark is this: Nietzsche certainly isn't the only one to register a profound shift. I've already mentioned Max Weber's account of the disenchantment of the world and of how the world is becoming secularized. And I think that we don't want to overplay this, because we all know that the embodied and impassioned pull of religion is still very important throughout the world. Obviously, it becomes important in many places in the world. Weber's point was that religion, when it became one compartment of life, and the best way to understand that in modern society is there are 5 days when you work, and there's a day when you play, there's a day when you have to do jury duty, a day when you have to vote, and then a day to go to church, and our lives become, as it were, fragmented and compartmentalized into these spheres. As that happened, which Weber saw as a process of secularization, as religion became, as it were, shrunken to this one day a week observance, okay, regardless of individuals. You could feel like you're doing it every day, but it's awfully hard, as I think a rather minor rock and roll star said, it's awfully hard to be a saint in the city. It's very difficult to be a Christian under those cultural and social conditions. Better than Bruce Springsteen's Saint in the City is Martin Scorsese's brilliant film Mean Streets, where one of the characters has for a hero St. Francis of Assisi, but what does he do? Well, he runs a little numbers, hangs out with a few minor hoods, and tries to get by in the city. And Scorsese wants to highlight for us this process by which this otherwise exemplary character cannot realize himself under those conditions. So sociologically, something has changed that has, something in society and about society has changed in such fundamental ways that the conditions required for God to live and thrive, whatever. As I say, if you're just a flat-out atheist, it's not going to be helpful because it won't make any sense. But then I find people who are just flat-out atheists to be boring. I mean, it's a boring view about anything. I'm sorry. It just bores me. But so the sociological remark is something really profound has changed in the world. Weber called it the disenchantment of the world. And even though it's old-fashioned to mention his name now in the new world order, Marx also noticed a profound change from the feudal to the capitalist mode of production. And he talked about the way that all fast frozen relations in feudalism, all these fixed systems of thought and inquiry, and there were systems of thought and inquiry, and worldviews in the medieval period were being rapidly torn asunder by the new forces of production and the new developments and technologies under capitalism, which Marx praises in the manifesto as being, in that regard, progressive. He says all those ancient feudal ties of blood and all these old ancient feudal relations, they had to be mercilessly ripped apart. And then Marx points out correctly, they were mercilessly ripped apart. So, in fact, the whole tradition of sociology is born from the attempt to understand the transition that was widely felt, not just by intellectuals, but by people in their ordinary lives, that had occurred between one massive way of producing and organizing life and another. One final example of the transition, and I'm going to take this one from science, is the production of, I saw this in a history of astronomy class once, the production of a new star map in which for the first time it had retained those round circles and things we associate with medieval maps, Earth, and the Earth was still in the middle, and then there were these things around it in perfect circles. And it had retained all that, and the stars were dotted out in the heavens, but it had no border. In other words, now, you looked up in the sky, and it wasn't just sort of pinholes of light. it had, as it were, gone beyond that. More stars than that. In fact, undecidable in the sense that not enough to count now, so I'm leaving the border off my damn map. This is not going to get burned by the church, because here's the map. It's just like they want. But I'm not going to put a frame around it. It can't be inframed. And so this